We are starting today an overview of the materials that we have provided for the twin webinar of September 2025. So the materials are in a repository. You have the link, and you have here uh, um, the clone of that repository. So you can see that there are different folders. So first of all, I'm going to focus on the dataset folder. So the dataset folder contains all the materials that have to do with the identities of the participants and the credentials needed in order to onboard participants and the assets they publish into the federated catalog. Remember that we are talking here about the dataset related to the educational use case, which is the three-way document data sharing. So in the identities folder for each of the participants, you have a folder, and in this folder you can find an identity, which is a DID with corresponding with the private keys, and of course in different formats. All these DIDs have been generated from seeds that are in these .m files. I'm not going to enter into the details on how these DIDs are generated, but essentially these DIDs, they really exist and are registered in the IOTA ledger. So the next folder I want you to take into account is the claims folder. So in the claims folder, we have the claims about the different participants, service offerings, data resources, and data space connector that are in the educational case. In the credentials folder, what we have is the evidence associated to the assets, but also the compliance credential. Remember that in order for these assets to appear, these entries to appear in the catalog, you need a compliance credential. And actually, here are multiple compliance credentials, one for each of the assets that we declare, but also one for each of the participants. So for instance, you can see the compliance credential for the for one of these for one of the participants. In this case, is the exporter from Poland, and these credentials have been signed by the clearinghouse. In this case, an special identity in our use case. So. And you can see, of course, in the evidence, the different evidences. So if we want to find the Poland exporter evidence, which is the credential that attests who is this exporter, registration number, etc., etc. So this is the structure in the data set. We have templates. Templates are templates for the generated credentials. It is not very relevant. The docs folder contains the public credentials that are needed as evidence in order to verify the compliance credentials. And this is mapped to the GitHub pages in order to have HTTP public references. And finally, the scripts folder contains different scripts are needed in order to generate these credentials for the different assets. In one of the cases, the scripts are fully automated. It's in the case of data resources, service offerings, and data space connectors. But in the case of participants, that has not been automated. So it needs some manual work you can derive from the other scripts. So this is in terms of the data set use. And actually what it happens is that with the different credentials and with an instance of the federated catalog launch, you can register those credentials and make them appear as entries. So the assets associated with the credentials can appear as assets in the federated catalog. So for instance, here we are seeing the data space connectors that are in the federated catalog, in my local federated catalog. This is a local instance, and you will see here the FSA federated catalog, the FSA data space connector, which essentially has a endpoint in localhost 4444. And that is interesting because later you will find in my example the connection of this. And here you can see the data space connector of the freight forwarder, which is in the 222 endpoint. So, and actually what it happens is that in the local instance that I have the data space connector, I have registered all the different entries or assets. So you can see that we have participants, register, so on and so forth. You can see here the different participants, the Food Standards Agency, the exporter from Poland, and so on and so forth. Exporter from Poland, the veterinary agency, and so on and so forth. So that's concerning the federated catalog, the entries that are needed in order to support the data space. So now we are entering into the details about the data space connector. So essentially, the data space connector folder contains two main subfolders. One is the test server. This is a test server essentially that instantiate the node libraries and instantiate all what is needed, but it is not I would say a full node. I not instantiated all the components, just the ones I needed. Of course, you could use the twin node that instantiate all the components as it was previously demonstrated by Adrian. So, and the important thing is that this data space connector server has a data space connector app, which is this, and you have you can see that the activities that can be handled by this data space connector are the creation of consignments and the addition of documents to consignments. This is what it is said. And actually, what is the aspect of a data space connector application? Well, essentially a data space connector applications, apart from some boilerplate, what essentially it is a component of a twin node. Is one of the one additional component of a twin node, and you can see here it has a constructor that all the dependencies can be injected. But the interesting thing, it has a star method, but the interesting thing is the handle activity method. So in the handle activity method, you receive the activity, you determine who is the actor behind the activity, what is the object of the activity, what is the target of the activity, and depending on that, you react to that. So you receive activities, and you in the data space connector app, you have your custom logic. So here, what it is done essentially when an activity is received is creating a vertex in the auditable item graph. Depends whether it is an addition of a document to a consignment, where it is more complex because there is needed two vertices and a relationship, an edge between them, or when you just receive a consignment and then a single vertex is created. So here you will see the two cases: create when you receive a consignment, a new consignment, and add when a new document is added to an existing consignment. Here the logic is a little bit more complex, and you can see here that we end up creating a vertex. And finally, you can see here how actually a notification between participants could work. So in this case, one data space connector application is receiving data, is receiving an activity, and when it is processed, decides according to certain conditions to be propagated to another data space connector of another actor. And that data space connector has been, those endpoints, etc., are obtained through the catalog. So going through the catalog, you can query the catalog and say, please give me the data space connector of the actor I want to notify. And once you know the actor and the endpoint, you can notify another data space connector and so on and so forth. So this way, all the data that the different data space connectors can be propagated. Of course, in the future, we plan to implement a subscribe interface that allows you to automate more on this. But even manually, you can decide to whom you want to propagate the data. So this is a very interesting aspect. And you can see there in the data space connector app blueprint how actually a data space connector works and can be implemented. Finally, I would like to finalize with a small demonstration. The demo starts with the following setup. We have a federated catalog up and running here. And then we have two different data space connectors. We have one data space connector on port 444, which corresponds to the UK Food Standards Agency. And we have a data space connector on port 2222, which corresponds to the freight forwarder. And what we plan to demonstrate is the data interchange between the exporter that notifies the freight forwarder that there is a new consignment first, and then for a document. So the veterinary certificate, this is a document that is also going to be notified from the exporter to the freight forwarder. And finally, the freight forwarder is going to propagate the availability of that document or pre-notify the Food Standards Agency. How this can be done? Well, first of all, you need to know that the federated catalog is in a state where there are the different data space connectors from the different actors are already being registered. So we have the data space connector of the UK FSA in 444. And we have the data space connector of the freight forwarder. And here they are registered. Why? Because they need to be discovered. So when the freight forwarder needs to get in touch with the UK Food Standards Agency, it needs to know what is the endpoint. Once the endpoint is known, through the W3C activity stream, the data will be communicated. And this is what we are going to show in this demonstration. And so first of all, we are going to start with the exporter telling through the data space connector that there is a new consignment to the freight forwarder. And here we use this consignment number. And with this consignment number, we notify the freight forwarder in the import 2222 through a standard activity object that it is encoded using the UNCFAT vocabulary. And there is an object, an activity create of an object of type consignment, a UNCFAT consignment. Destination country is UK. This is the global ID of the consignment. And here is the exporter party that actually corresponds to our exporter. So execute, and you will see here that the consignment has been processed successfully. So you need to take into account, by the way, that the processing that the data space connector makes is asynchronous. So that allows us for the maximum scalability. So the caller does not need to wait for the
data space connector to process this. But remember that the data space connector, after some initial checks, is going to delegate into a data space connector app, our data space connector app that we have described formerly. And if you see here the logs, this is the app that has been executed, and then a new item has been created in the auditable item graph. So what can be seen here? Well, you can see that the auditable item graph, we can check over the auditable item graph of our node that the vertex, the corresponding vertex, has been created. And here, if we check, we will see that the vertex, which annotation object corresponds to our consignment, has been created. So the data has been received by the data space connector and the twin node of the freight forwarder, and now it's aware of this consignment. But now we want to notify the freight forwarder that the veterinary certificate is available. It does not mean that the document itself is going to be obtained by the fully stored, by the freight forwarder. Only a reference to the document is known, and possibly the freight forwarder, for ensuring that the document is not tampered with, may calculate a fingerprint and just store the fingerprint. That's also can be part of the functionality offered by the data space connector app. So that would be done for integrity reasons. Of course, if the document is has some integrity, the document may have its own integrity measurements there, but of course, the document could be changed in the middle. So that's why it's interesting, that functionality of calculating fingerprints. But this is not shown in this demo. So here we are going to notify that there is a new document here. So the activity type is add. We are adding a new document to the consignment that we recently created. And this is the document. It's a document of type veterinary certificate. This is the identifier. And the issuer corresponds to the police veterinary agency. So now we submit the activity, and the data space connector of the freight forwarder will react, delegating into the data space connector app. And the good thing is that we have to create a new vertex. Now we have two different vertices, and those vertices are actually related through an edge. So now if I consult the same, query the same vertex that we had initially created, you will see that now there is an edge towards a new auditable item vertex that if I query it, corresponds exactly to the document that we have just received. But not only that, because as it is a consignment, which destination country, remember, is the UK, and it is with the proper commodity, and also the document that we have supplied is a veterinary document, is a veterinary certificate, then the UK Food Standards Agency has been notified. And you see here that the 4444 data space connector has been sent the corresponding payload, so that now the UK knows the UK FSA knows that there is this new document concerning this consignment. And you can see here, and in the data space connector of port 444, you can see here that there is a new activity, and now they know that there is a document with those identifiers that it is available. Of course, they know the document, they know who the issuer is, they know who notified them about this document. So essentially, if someone wants to download by the Food Standard Agency that document or wants to retrieve that document, would be easy. Why? Because they remember that the service offering of the freight forwarder has already a policy that says that there is an agreement between the Food Standards Agency and the freight forwarder for this kind of document. So once the document ID is known, the document could be retrieved. And actually, the Food Standard Agency Data Space Connector application could have retrieved it to the service and just fingerprint it. That functionality is not built yet, but is feasible, as we say, once the query interface of the Data Space Connector is available. And remember that you can see the service registrations, the service offerings. If I query them, you will see that there is a query service offer by the freight forwarder, which is this. And you see the permission is that the destination country is UK. And of course, the type of document is this one. So in those cases, you can share documents with the corresponding, with the UK FSA, because the policy is saying that. And in the future, once we integrate the rights management component, the data space connector itself will evaluate this policy and will say yes or no when an actor wants to retrieve through the query interface that kind of document, and so on and so forth. And remember that this demo and the data sets are available in the Twain Webinar 2 demo in the link that we have already shared with you in the slides. And you will see in the data space connector, you will see a data space connector app blueprint, where you will see the app blueprint for the data space connector app for these different actors. And you will see the test server as well, that allows you to just instantiate a data space connector service, a twin node with a data space connector service that actually has access or has registered, this data space connector app blueprint. So in the test server, you can say that the data space connector for the webinar is the one that it is here, and it is that application is handling documents and consignments from UNCFAT, so on and so forth. And remember that all the data for the federated catalog is in the dataset folders. I hope this demo has been successful for your learning purposes, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you very much for your attention.